Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Trip, a psychedelic therapy podcast with me, Dr. Esme Dark. During this podcast, I'll be bringing you conversations with thought leaders and other inspiring humans, exploring a wide variety of themes relating to the use of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in the healing of human distress. Whether you're an aspiring therapist, already a therapist, or just simply interested in the emerging field of psychedelic therapy, then this podcast is for you. Join me for a journey into the psychedelic world. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded land on which this podcast is recorded, the Wadawurrung people. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Beyond the Trip podcast, where I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Pedram Dara. Pedram is the founder and director of Psychedelic Lived Experiences, which is a patient-led initiative bridging clinical science and lived experience to strengthen decision-making in research, practice, and policy through integrating insights. He's a former participant in an MDMA-assisted therapy clinical trial, and Pedram has advocated for improved patient safety and treatment efficacy since 2019. Combining his background in media and technology with qualitative intelligence and systems design, he's building participant-centered infrastructure that enhances safety, ethics, and long-term outcomes in clinical innovation. He organizes the Psychedelic Lived Experiences Summit, which I attended, and it was really a fantastic resource. I recommend checking it out. A global convening of over 3,000 attendees from 74 countries, uniting patients, trial participants, therapists, and researchers to center lived experience and institutional decision-making. His perspectives have been shared with policymakers at the US, FDA, and the European Parliament, and featured in leading journals, including Nature Medicine. Pedram collaborates with researchers, therapists, sponsors, and regulators to reinforce governance, risk visibility, and accountability, helping to shape a future where healthcare advances with rigor, integrity, and the people most affected at the center. There's a lot of shared values between him and I in the work that we do. And so we got into lots of great conversations. We talked about his journeys into this work and a little bit about the MDMA-assisted therapy clinical trial. And we talked about the Lived Experience Summit and its impact, the challenges and of collaborating, and also the joy of collaborating and integrating lived experience into different areas of the field. Trial space, also the clinical space outside of trials as well. We talked about the importance of therapy flexibility and long-term therapeutic relationships within this kind of work. And we talked about structured advisory boards, which I think are a really important piece that can be missing in some areas of this work, and the importance of bringing the lived experience perspective into training as well as into trials and clinical practice. So let's get into it. I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I hope to have Pedram back again as well. So at some point you will be hearing from him again, I'm sure. So enjoy, and I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Hi, Pedram. Welcome to the podcast. It's so wonderful to have you here and to be, spending some time together. We've been kind of going back and forwards, trying to find some space for a little while now. And so I'm delighted to welcome you to the podcast to talk about something really important, something that you've been really championing, which is the perspective of lived experience in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy space in research, but also it feels actually really important here in Australia, where, of course, we're rolling out these treatments into the community. So, yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Hi, Esme. Thanks for having me. Yeah, excited to be here and speaking with you.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, do you want to start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to be involved in psychedelic research or psychedelic therapy in this way?
Sure. So around late 2018 is when actually I sort of learned about psychedelic therapy as a concept. But also was around the same time that I was actually learning about my mental health challenges. So for me, in a way, putting, like figuring out what I was struggling with in terms of the problem was also in parallel when I was discovering the solution. So I'm not,
Mm,
like a lot of people I met that maybe like they were on SSRIs for like maybe a decade. They tried 10 different things. That's not me. My case wasn't. I actually wasn't. I was just sort of struggling in my own ways, not really understanding it. I didn't grow up with mental health culture and education. So like I couldn't really figure out what it was actually before I could even take action on it. So not knowing what the
mm,
problem was obviously didn't allow me to take action. So I was just sort of like
of
suffering in
course.
my own
Yeah.
world, not knowing what's going on until I sort of like when I learned about MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, it was like sort of the first time that like the problems and solutions sort of crystallized both at the same time. And that was around late 2018, which is around the
Interesting.
same time that I learned about the clinical trials of MDMA-assisted therapy back in Canada. And that sort of was the entry point for me to get into this world.
Mm. Yes, because you're based over in Canada, aren't you? And did Maps have a big profile back then, or had you
Not
heard
at
of them before?
all.
No.
Not at
Yeah.
all. Honestly, 2018,
Yeah.
nobody was talking about psychedelics, like in general,
Yeah.
like, let alone even
Mm.
maps. Like, I mean, there was a few people, of course, those that knew, they knew, but there wasn't like, so just so you know,
Mm.
so before my case, so there was a phase 2 site in Vancouver, which I believe they had maybe about 6 participants.
Yep.
And that must have been like 4 or 5 years already before my
Okay.
turn. And then nothing was happening. So that was just one part of Canada in British Columbia that ever happened. So one site, one study, and then sort of was stopped for 4 or 5 years. And then when they got to get ready for phase 3, they needed for the therapists to complete their study their training, they needed to then, obviously do the week-long training, but they had to do an experiential case. So it was a requirement
Yeah.
for them to do a single experiential case with an actual human participant to then complete the training, which they could then go on and work on phase 3. So at that
Right.
point, they were opening a site in Montreal for them to then work on phase 3, but
Yeah.
they needed to do one phase 2 participant open label, which is then end up being my case for them to then
Yeah.
complete the training to then go and work on phase 3. So no, back then there was, basically very little activity. Now there's like a
Yeah.
few organizations in the field. Nothing was around. Nobody was really talking about it as much. So
Yeah. Yeah. So you were really one of the first people in Canada to be in the trial,
yeah,
or
so I
one of
found out
yeah.
that outside of
Yeah.
that, I sort of became the first one ever outside of British Columbia, which is that one
Yeah.
province, to ever receive a psychedelic as part of a clinical trial in Canada. Yeah, I didn't even know
Wow.
myself the significance of it going into it. In Quebec, which is
Yeah.
where I did it, definitely I became the first one.
Yeah.
And so it only like as I got into it, I actually realized what a big deal that was, or like how lucky I got to actually be selected as the one.
Yeah. And I'm actually really struck by what you shared at the beginning there about like not really knowing what the problem was. And so not knowing what was going on, but knowing that there was some struggles, but then how do you then seek the treatment for something? And I feel like that's a very common thing, particularly with PTSD, because I feel like people think it's one thing, maybe like they've seen maybe in the popular press that it has to be those kind of flashbacks that people traditionally associate with PTSD. And actually, it can be so many other things. And they associate it with a certain type of person, maybe. I think it's the trauma understanding is changing, but it's still, there's a lot of unknowns in the community. So it's interesting to hear you say that.
Yeah, like honestly, I thought it's just a thing for soldiers.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
that's it. I thought,
Yeah.
you go to war and that's it. Like I didn't even know. I think maybe then, of course, I found out about like, of course, the sexual assault trauma and things like that. But like, I think, most of my understanding, which is when I learned about MDMA therapy and, sort of for PTSD, like the gap that it created in my mind, because they too could have not been more different from each other, right? To me, I was like, well, I thought PTSD was about war and governments and like,
Yeah.
first responders and regulated world and with like a lot of oversight. And then on the other hand, you have something like MDMA, which is, sort of like something illegal, something, like it's a drug. And it's just like, how could these two even be related? I think that's sort of what piqued my interest at first. When I first started, I was like, what's going on here? Like, I almost need to know everything about this.
Yeah, I know. It's fascinating, isn't it? And, and when we think of MDMA, so, I did a talk on this not so long ago. The first thing that people think about is nightclubs, right? But actually it was used therapeutically first, right? Which not a lot of people know.
I didn't know. Yeah. So
No, I don't think I don't reckon I knew either until I started in this work.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And so you actually, the reason that I heard about you and what you were doing is through the Lived Experience Summit that you created, which was an excellent and is still available to people. We'll talk a bit about that later and how people can access it. But I'm familiar with the term lived experience, but not all of our listeners may be so familiar with that. So do you want to define that, explain what you mean by that, what it means to you in this space?
Sure. And it's an evolving thing for me. I'm actually reading a fantastic book called Blind Spots, and highly recommend it because it's just sort of validating a lot of things that I sort of was seeing in myself and the field, which is around this sort of disconnect between science and human experience. And so that's really our blind spot because, right, we're trying to like quantify everything. We're trying to like, take somebody's life if it was an onion, and then we're just looking at one single layer of that one onion, right? That's not somebody's full life, right? So like, human experience, it's vague, it's messy, it's hard to quantify. So because of that, scientists don't like that, right? So it's just, that's why it's been sort of pushed away, and it's like usually anecdotal, and it just doesn't get the attention. It's nothing new about psychedelics in this time. It's just how the world works. This is everywhere. If you look at everywhere, I think since we brought academia to the world, back before universities, perhaps, like, you took a job because of your father's lived experience or your own lived experience. You had to go somewhere, you learned something, and that became your thing. Your expertise came from your experience, right? And then universities come around, and then now expertise comes from the title, right? The letters, the alphabet soup that comes after your name, right? Not so much of that. So once we went that direction, now it's created this gap between the human experience and, sort of the science that we sort of need both. It's like a coin, right? So if you're just looking at it, you're just looking at the one side, but it's not the full picture, right? So the way I understand lived experience now is that, first of all, there are two different types of it. So as it relates to this conversation, so there's your lived experience of, let's say, having some sort of a health indication or a diagnosis, mental, physical, and then what does it mean, right? So like somebody has PTSD, right? So like, what does it mean to go through the process of finding a therapist, finding a psychiatrist, trying one SSRI, trying another SSRI, trying 5 more SSRIs, doing one more talk therapy, then doing EMDR, just like 5 years of just figuring out how to even care for that. That by itself is a very unique type of lived experience, which is mainly around the problem, right? So like, what is it depression? Is it PTSD? Is it back pain? Whatever it is, right? That process of just figuring out how to live with this thing, how to find solution for this thing is already one form of lived experience. Then the second form is sort of when you took on some sort of a solution. So somebody who's been on SSRI for 20 years, now they have lived experience of living with depression, but they also have the lived experience of taking a standard of care for 20 years, which is, let's say, some sort of an SSRI, right? So those are two different sort of unique lived experiences that in this case can be very useful. And at times you could just need one or the other, or sometimes you need both. So depending on what phase of developing a solution is, so I would say if it's in the early phases of developing the solution for PTSD, then you probably want to tap into the lived experience of a whole bunch of people with PTSD diagnosis, right? Yes. And then as you go on and decide what the solution is, let's say you decided you want to try psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy as a solution, well, then it would be ideal to now also go speak to people who have been experiencing psychedelic-assisted therapy to be like, what does that look like, right? So like really depending on where you are in the process of developing a treatment, I think you could tap into different forms of lived experience.
Yeah, brilliant. And, I don't know how much you know about what's happening in Australia with the lived experience movement here. I think you did say you knew a little bit about this. In Victoria, the state I live in, there was a huge investigation into our mental health system. And it's been going on, it was going on for quite a few years. And then they produced a report about changes to the mental health system. And one of the major things was we need to bring lived experience perspective into service design, service development, right? And so that's been a big focus here. It's still tricky at times and it's not perfect, but the government has really put the focus on that area. So
I would say Australia is probably one of the leaders in that, and there are a few countries that are doing well. I would say UK is doing well. Generally, Northern European countries do better around that, and then Australia. So actually Canada better than United States is not at all. I would say it's way behind on that. Canada is slightly better. So I would say, but the downside of that is that what I've seen, and I've spoken to those working in Australia in the field, that is also it's how you do it, right? Over there, and you speak to a few experts there, they feel like there's a lot of lip syncs around it. There's a lot of make sure you throw that name in your application, right? So it's just a little okay, we got that. So it's still a bit tokenizing, right? Which to me, it's still better than not doing it at all, right? Even if you're just doing something, even if you're putting something out there, it just proves that governments are realizing that expertise that comes through academia, it's not enough, right? It's needed, but it's not enough by itself, right? You could be the world's best psychiatrist and you still have no idea what it feels to have addiction and to slip on the street one night.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and now you have a patient who's struggling with addiction, and then he comes to you, and then here you are with your crazy salary and love, good life, and you're in the probably 5% of the world. And what helps therapy is apparently a therapeutic alliance. So how do you expect someone who's been homeless and is struggling with drug addiction to develop therapeutic alliance with the 1% of the world? It's just the gap is so much that there's no way they can actually truly connect, right? But if you take a psychiatry resident and you have them go spend time with, people that are on the street instead of sitting in a university class, well, then something changes.
Absolutely. Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's so, it's so important. And I feel like here in Australia, we are rolling out MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, of course. And there's a lot of research trials. When I started in the research space here, there wasn't many MDMA-assisted therapy research trials, but there's more now. So we really need to be talking to people like you who've had the experience of going through those trials, because the trial protocol is, of course, what's being rolled out to help understand and to build service delivery, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that it happens enough. There's always room. I think in Australia, I have to say, the best places that I've worked are things like the youth mental health services. They've really got it. I have to say, Headspace, shout out to Headspace. They're really good at that. But there's the adult mental health system. I think there's still a lot of work there.
Yeah. And, in the addiction space, I think also as things are better. But, again, I think, we are at the question of what is actually lived experience. I also want to mention that at times people feel like, oh, that means peers. It just means connect someone with PTSD with someone else with PTSD. Yes, that is definitely peer support is definitely one way, but it's just one thing, right? To me, lived experience is just not enough for someone to actually have experience of going through a treatment or, let's say, a mental health situation. That's an entry point. To me, it's just the same way, right? It's even if you go become a psychologist, you go and study, you get a master's in psychology, let's say, but you still have to go get your license, right? So getting the master's is the entry point. But you still have to apply for the exam or licensing, I'm assuming, right? Before you can call yourself that, right? So to me, it's kind of like that, right? So it's enough for someone to okay, I've been struggling with depression. I've been trying SSRIs. I know about this. That's the entry point just for you to, say, I have some lived experience. But the magic happens when you can take that experiential learning and translate it into something that actually the scientists and the researchers and the physicians can actually understand and do something about it. That piece of the puzzle is missing, right? You still don't really have a good way of translating and bridging this to world, which is sort of what I'm trying to focus on these days. It's we don't just need more lived experience input. We actually need more bridge building between sort of the clinical science and lived experience, right? Because we have to learn how could we turn our insights into actually something useful.
Yes. And so there's lots of things I want to ask about this, but what do you think that might look like in terms of what that bridge could become, and how lived experience perspective could shape maybe the design, the delivery of these kind of psychedelic assisted therapy trials? Let's focus on the trials to start with. It's probably the easiest place to begin.
So I would say the easiest thing is thinking through where are decisions made. Like every time there is a table where decisions are made at that table, well, there should be a seat for, well, not there should, there must be a seat for a lived experience, right? Even if that means a single person, 2 people, 5 people, that hopefully a board of advisory board of people with multiple different experiences, right? Because even within the lived experience, you could have a lived experience with psychedelics that went well for you. You could have lived experience with psychedelic treatment that didn't go well for you. One that was sort of so-so, one that like it helped but also hurt, right? So like hopefully you have some sort of an advisory board, and then maybe a representative, right? So that's they're sitting at the table. So if there is a PI, a psychiatrist sitting there, if there's a psychologist sitting there, if there is a neuroscientist sitting there, well, hopefully somebody will live the experience more than one is also sitting there. So it's just a balance, right? So because in that way, they can always bring that perspective that otherwise they wouldn't, because they have all these other professions. They have so much to think about and worry about and things to do. And these are some of the things that came from interviewing these experts for the summit. I learned myself, like even the ones that I thought care a lot about it, they admitted why it keeps going down the priority list, right? Because they have to do so much other things. So it's understandable for them that they can't be thinking about all the things at once, right? So like a medical professional is going to think about all the things that have to do with medical world. The psychotherapist might think about all the things that have to do with the therapy framework, right? They can't think of like, how about the curtain? How about, where's the bathroom? How about the blanket type? How about, like getting the caregivers involved? How about like millions of other things that they just cannot be thinking about? But someone with lived experience can think about those things. So they can be like, oh, okay, cool. Well, how about that? Oh, well, we didn't think of that. And then they'll be like,
where is the bathroom?
Yeah.
Wow, that's important.
We should think about that, Joe. Okay. Wow. You know what I mean? And this is stuff coming out. There's research on this. I was part of a research where they discovered this was one of the key things for participants, the location of bathroom. And, you know, and it's not in the conversations when they're making those decisions because they don't have representative, right? So it only afterwards that somebody has to share the feedback and be like, oh, and then they're like, okay, on the next one, hopefully we can fix that. So it's just around decision making. Every time there's a decision being made that, because think about it, in the end, who are the main stakeholders, right? So the trial participants and patients eventually are going to be the ones that have a lot to gain and a lot to lose. To the psychiatrist working on the study, to the psychologist, it's another Tuesday at work. To the individual, it's their entire life, right? So when it works well for them, everything's at stake, right? So it doesn't really make sense to then decisions being made for you that impact you, but you had no representation there. So it's like living in a society that is called democratic, but you don't have members of parliament that represents your area, whatever your system is, right? So it's just kind of like that. So it's like, it's really a dictatorship, if you ask me, because the individuals have no representation. So some people who decided that they have all the power because they have the money and the job title and whatever, make all the decisions that impacts everybody. Right. So in a way, we need to bring back a more of democratic way of making decisions into the psychedelic trials too, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think I don't want to take on too much of a side. I don't think this is a side quest, but the system of academia and the way in which randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for good reasons. But I feel that they don't fit so well with the kind of human therapeutic research. And I could do a whole hour talking about that, but I feel like that's where the lived experience voice needs to come in, but also people like me as a therapist who's also been involved in research trials is really important for us to, and we do, I certainly sort of encourage the more qualitative interview, human-based research side of things. And I have to say at the clinical psychedelic lab, the big trials I've worked on, they have done both, which is really important. But that's just one side of it. Yeah, that's just one side of it. And
there's so many other areas. And we had a bathroom issue in our first trial, and it was, we're working with what we've got at the university too, right? So we were very lucky. We had a beautiful space, but the bathroom was pretty far away from where the dosing room was. And that was actually great for some people and not great for others. Yeah.
And I'm glad you say that, because that's a great example of when, you can't really standardize this. This is why having a lived experience advisory board is a necessity, because even if you just have one representation, right? And that one person might be okay with walking extra to the bathroom. Well, then what? Now we're going to make that decision. And based on that one single person, probably also doesn't make sense, right? So you know what I mean? So we need to find a way that we could hopefully make better decisions. I think our decision-making process is what needs to improve more than anything else. And more representation, of course, helps with that, because it's just more data, right?
Exactly. And more opinions. Something I've seen, I worked for many years in refugee mental health. And so in Australia, and we had a lot of advisory board models that would sort of feed into different service delivery, development, etc. But sometimes you end up with just the same people sort of because they enjoy it, because they have time or whatever, and they become the only voice from a community, and that's not helpful either. So it's quite important, I think, to do what you're saying, to kind of spread, to have different opinions and spread the load as well. Because the other thing that I've certainly come across is that people can feel quite burnt out when they're the only lived experience person in a space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think sometimes you actually, like I myself, I think the input I can bring is good in certain areas, not so good in certain other areas. Sometimes knowing too much is not actually good. Sometimes you really want like someone's fresh experience, like, someone who doesn't know the field. Like I right now know too much. So for me, I actually have to work more on system level things rather than my own individual. So I'm trying to now move away from my own individual ideas and the way that I thought things should be run. And I'm more at the system level and see like, how can I incorporate more, which is why the summit came out, right? Because otherwise I could have just put something on and I just talk about things myself, right? So I think that's important. Sometimes you just want to know someone's experience who doesn't even know what MAPS is, who's never heard of Rick Dublin's name, who's never been to a conference, who's never like listened to a podcast or like, but they were just a PTSD patient that learned about this study and they just like, that is very unique, right? But then you also want sometimes maybe input of someone like myself, because I've spoken to so many other people, because I get some of the system level stuff. So you see what I mean? So like that's why if you just bring me, I don't think it's good enough. And the same way if you just brought the other guy, right? So hopefully, again, that's why we need to widen that, right? So that we can have more perspectives.
Yeah. And as we're here, tell us a bit about the Lived Experience Summit and bringing that together, because it was really fantastic to join for some of it. And I bought the package and I'm watching all the videos back at different times. And it's been a really great resource. And actually, a lovely bit of feedback that I don't know if it made its way to you was from one of my colleagues who just really appreciated and felt like so much of what was being shared are things that we as therapists have intuitively thought of and felt. And so to have that kind of put out there in that way was really, really moving and affirming for a lot of us.
Thank you for sharing it. Thank you, first of all, for being a part of it and joining. Yeah, I've heard a lot of that too. So, and the way it came out is that, so after I finished my own experience of participating in the study, maybe within a year or so, I just got approached by, like, again, that time there wasn't just that many people like myself. So I got approached by others and, I was offered to like, oh yeah, do you want to come share your story of this experience or this conference or that? So I began sort of like doing this like public speaking, I would say, activities that I never had done before, right? So, but, so I would go to conferences and I would just, like either speak about my experience or I would check how other conferences are. And then eventually I started noticing how this tokenizing thing, I started noticing either the conferences that I was going to or the discussions that I was part of, either lived experience had no place at all, or, like there was no patients and trial participants representations, or it would be like, oh, we have 160 therapists and doctors talking. I guess we need one patient there, right? Oh, here's a panel with 6 people, and then maybe we just need a single patient there, right? So I just realized that it was just being a best case scenario. I think someone told me it's like 90% of time is just not happening. 5% of time is tokenizing. 5% of time is actually done well, right? So I noticed that 90%, yet they were just like completely missing. So I started looking at every major psychedelic organization, from pharma to training to nonprofits. And I tell anyone to go check on it for yourself. When you look at their advisory board or the nonprofit board or whatever board, there is absolutely zero representation of people with lived experience. Like it's 0.001 if there is, right? So it's like, it just doesn't exist. So it's just MDs and PhDs, MDs and PhDs, or some business guy or some policy guy, right? So it's just, and then in the end, I was like, wow, like it's kind of crazy that everybody is like, the whole field is built around what's going to happen to these patient populations. But then where are the patients themselves? Like, why are all these people just talking about us as if we're just a bunch of numbers, and nobody really knows what the story, especially when they're quantifying it, right? It's like, nobody even know what this, everybody's a participant, some random participant number. You don't even know the name of this person. You don't know anything about their lives. And then people go on stages and they just talk about these as if it was their own life. And I was just noticed this gap that I was like, wow, like, I just feel like we're not paying enough attention. We're not really systematically capturing. We're not doing, I found out that none of the health regulatory agencies, they don't require qualitative research. Everything is quantitative. So qualitative work is just basically an expense. It's an extra expense. It's not required. So nobody does it. Or at times they don't really want to know. Doing qualitative work reveals certain things that perhaps, depending on what agenda do you have, what kind of paper do you want to publish, you may not want to know. You may just want to show, a distorted version of truth that fits with your agenda, whether that agenda is you're getting a drug approved or you're getting your PhD done or whatever the case is. There's some other agenda that you're trying to sort of paints the picture towards your own narrative. So once I realized that, and then I was like, okay, well then sort of what could I do with that? I realized that the best I could do is, instead of doing more advocacy work around just psychotherapy as a solution for mental health, I realized that actually I needed to zoom down on this area, making sure that we're paying enough attention. And by doing that is when I realized actually the bridge building is what was missing. I realized that it wasn't that we just needed to have these people. I realized that these people need to be talking to each other more. Like there should be more therapists talking to patients. There should be more trial participants talking to neuroscientists, right? And that just doesn't happen at none of the conferences that I went, right? I was usually the one. Right. So and I was like, okay, if these people are not really talking to the end users or the customers or the clients or whatever you want to call them, if they're not talking to them, well, then how can you innovate for them?
Yeah, exactly. It's so important. And so you put the summit out there, right? And so I'll put the link so people can have a look and they can still sign up and watch the videos. But what are some of the most kind of meaningful things that and surprising moments from kind of gathering all that information that you learned?
Yeah. I mean, I think I share maybe the surprising. So one of the surprising things for me was, or something that perhaps just needed to happen, was that because this conference, so maybe I'll just a little bit share more. So originally I wanted the conference to be only about patients and trial participants. I was like, I just want a conference where all the speakers, all the talks, everything is on lived experience, right? Going through that process is when I realized, oh no, we need the experts too, right? We need two sides of the coin. I can't now, otherwise I'm just going to make the same mistakes. I'm just going to double down on one side of the truth and dismiss the other side of the truth. So if anything, I realized this needs to be more about bridge building. And at times I actually got criticism from people like, oh, I thought this was supposed to be about lived experience. How come you have all these therapists and researchers involved again, right? So some people didn't even understand it, right? I think those that didn't pay enough attention didn't actually watch the talks, probably anyone that judged the book by the cover. Usually that comes from those people. But those that did engage with it, they realized why. Because now I'm talking to the ones and I'm like, can you tell me why are you not doing this? What are the systemic issues? Why is this not happening? Or areas where this was happening, let's say in Australia. Well, Paul, tell us, how is that happening, right? What's working over there? Or Imperial College, Sarah, tell us, what are you doing there? So there was actually pockets of this work that was happening already that this allowed a way for others to find out. We're like, oh, if they could do that at Portland, VA, I guess we could also do that where we are. If they're doing it over there, maybe we could also do that. So I realized that this could also reveal both the gaps and the systemic issues as well as the opportunities. Like
the solutions,
right?
sometimes.
And the solutions sometimes, or
Yeah.
knowing like, well, yeah, for especially when it's global, right? Okay, what is it working in Australia? Could we do that in England or vice versa? And so that's the reason I decided to then sort of split it. So I ended up with 27 patients and trial participants and 27 mostly therapists and researchers working in the field who I thought that they care more about this topic. But the surprising part was that because the conference wasn't organized by some big name and organizations behind it, it was fully independent and grassroots, is that the way these experts who normally had seen them speak at many different conferences around the world, they all spoke differently. They spoke as if like they didn't care somebody was watching. I felt like they were more themselves, right? So like the words they used, the way they would talk, I felt like if like their shoulders were down, they were not worried about like, oh, like this is, I don't know, you have a sponsor. What does this mean compared to what I'm working on? So because it was coming from the community, actually, sort of like bottom up approach. So the surprising fact was that people were more themselves. That was sort of unexpected for me because I had seen them speak in other conferences. I'm like, wow, I had never seen you speak this way.
This way, yeah, of course. And isn't that's the beautiful thing about doing this kind of interview? I guess it's a little similar to the way that I do it on the podcast, and I think it's bringing up something that I've been sitting with, which is it's interesting. There is this kind of split between the lived experience and the professionals and the psychologists and the academics, and then also as well, and in therapy, a lot of therapists come from that kind of wounded healer place where maybe they have had their own experiences either with themselves or with a close family member. It's extremely common, but it's also not spoken about publicly that much.
That's it.
And in the UK, where I trained, it was, this was quite a long time ago, to be fair. It might have changed. It was 20 plus years ago now, and I feel old. But when I trained, it was discouraged for us to share about our own experiences of mental health. Even people that I know had to kind of go through extra processes when they went to work for the National Health Service because they had a history of mental health problems and they were becoming a psychologist. And so that's the systems level creating more separation, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, that's definitely. So my favorite is actually, I call them professionals with lived experience. Like those that, the wounded healers, those that so like I love to work with a physician who's also struggling with PTSD, right? Because that person would get you. That person is the perfect person to work with because they've been on the two sides, right? So they know something about it. So, but like you said, the systemic issues are that they got to worry about their license. I don't want to say something and now right? And then at times, actually, there are no, I've spoken to, now I have most of my friends are now healthcare professionals that we license. So I asked them, a lot of them, they're like, no, there's actually any rules. Even a psychiatrist for now here in Canada, he told me, he's like, I could totally tell my patient that I'm on SSRI and I'm depressed and all of that. There's no law or rules that stops me, but it's just not common practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So I don't want to be the one that is going to now do something. And you know what I mean? So like, actually the regulations are not really systematically stopping. It's just more the culture around it, the way people have been doing it, the sort of a status quo that stops that. And I think it's one of those things, let's just call self-disclosure, right? Therapy language. I think it's just, there's time for it and place for it. I don't think it's one of those things that you should standardize for or against, right? I think it's just something between the two. If you think it's it's going to help with the process, then it makes sense. In my own experiences, there were times that I inquired about my own therapists in the study and I asked them personal questions and they answered. And it did help me. It made me feel closer to them, right? But they only revealed it in the sort of benefits of my process.
Exactly.
So,
yes. And
that's hard to standardize.
Yes. But that's, I think, comes from, hopefully that's the kind of stuff from experience, from training as a therapist that you learn, because absolutely you wouldn't want your therapist probably feel really unsafe actually if your therapist was like, I've got the, spilling their guts about their life.
There. Yeah, for sure.
Right. But I think interesting in the psychedelic work that I've done, I've probably have shared a little more of myself than I would in my general therapy practice, particularly around my own experience with the psychedelic therapy that I had as part of my training, because that feels really important to be able to say, yes, I've been on that couch where you are. I've had the same psilocybin that you had. We did that as part of our trial, as I think you know. But I wouldn't share like the deepest, most painful, difficult parts of that, which were a part of that too, right?
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
Because it's not all the fun and games.
No,
right?
for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
as far as clinical trials are concerned, I do want to mention that, this is another thing that I realized through this process. Like every time I say live the experience to people means different things. Like a lot of times people feel like, oh yeah, but I'm taking MDMA in a festival too. Like I've heard this from therapists and researchers, right? As if they know what it feels like taking MDMA, obviously off record, right? They're like, oh, I've taken MDMA. I know what it feels like. I'm like, you taking MDMA in Coachella has nothing to do with taking MDMA in a clinical trial or MDMA-assisted psychotherapy
with
for
an
PTSD, right? Like it's just, no, just first of all, the intention is therapeutic, not party, not friends. It's like, who knows what you even took. And the whole process of going through a clinical trial process, like consent form and showing up and these hundreds of things you got to do. And that's a very unique, like back to types of lived experience. The lived experience of going through a clinical trial by itself is very unique, right? It's not the same to get MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD in Australia as part of the, let's say, the scheme that you have versus as part of a trial. Same country, it will be two different lived experience. The one that you pay $30,000 and get it privately out of pocket today versus, let's say, the ones that are doing for climate or first responders that might be a trial, right? So even in the same country, right, the same regulator, same treatment, same compound, the two experiences are different because I met people here in Canada so I got it through a clinical trial. I met someone here who got it through the special access program, which is similar to what you have in Australia. And when we speak about each other's experiences, I'm like, what? Like, how is this the same treatment? Like yours was like so different. You had so much more like they had a lot more wiggle room around like things they wanted to do, whereas in the trial is very strict. And that's if you got the active.
Yes.
Now, getting placebo, well, I don't think there's ever going to be a healthcare professional out there who's ever been to a clinical trial and has received placebo. So most will have no idea, including myself, what it feels like to go through a clinical trial process, all the things, and in the end, end up with placebo. Like that by itself is another form of unique experience. Back to being surprises. One of the surprises that came up in the summit was that, like revealing this, what does it feel like even to have that lived experience, to go through that process. And then they tell you, well, you got to wait 2.5 years before you can get that thing again. And it's like, well, I just gave you a year of my life. I'm not going to wait another 2.5 years, right? So like,
that's a long
that
time,
by itself, it's like this was a special case of someone, right? So it was a COVID time and all that. So one of the surprising things happened. I think this panel is available. Since you have access, you should definitely watch it. So like it was a panel of a phase 3 of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. So someone receiving placebo where they didn't like the experience versus someone receiving placebo, we thought they got the real thing. Like these two experiences could be far from each other. You couldn't be farther from each other, right?
Wow.
Same trial. And then we have the psychiatrists from the site and then we had, let's say, the chief scientific officer of the company. So like this had never been done before. This outside of this summit or conference organized would just never be done before. It would just be like, well, that's too risky. You're not going to, like the lawyers will probably not approve anything like that. But like we made space for that. And for this one individual who I just spoke about their case, for them, they just having that panel where they felt like the people responsible for this experience were there and they're there to validate, let's say, their experience was healing myself. So like I organized this panel as a way of like teaching people about this experience. Next thing you know, it's like, I'm crying, they're crying. Like it was deeply emotional experience because you just felt like it became this place for this individual to really feel validated that like their experience matters and perhaps they could have done things better, right? So these are some of the surprising things that came out of the summit that I just think like once we made that space for it, these sort of things showed up that I could have never planned for.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. My co-therapist and I, David Spector, were the two people that had the most placebo cases on our trial. So almost all of the people I worked with had placebo first, not all, but maybe, 70% of the people I took through out of about 30. And, it's really challenging. Some people did think they got the real thing, which I find fascinating.
Same, I know.
With psilocybin too, like it's really interesting, but some people found it really useful because they felt that they had longer to get to know us. People, particularly people where there was a lot of complex trauma in their background. But of course, there's huge disappointment, and people have to come off their psychiatric medications for these trials. And there was a lot of challenge. And so I know that the clinical psychedelic lab is really trying to avoid placebo trials. I'm not sure. I haven't watched Paul's interview. I'm not sure if he spoke about that with you, but he's really trying to not do that where he can.
I agree. I think I used to say it's borderline unethical. Now I gained the courage to say it is actually unethical. We just need to stop taking people with like serious mental health issues and then give them a hope of some sort of, especially treatment that has received public and media attention. If this was something no one has ever heard of, okay, sure. But something that like imagine being someone who received a placebo, and then you hear the news and the headline when it's talking about this as a revolution. You're like, oh, really? But I didn't get that. That's deeply hurtful to that individual. Because you're like, what was like, and this is somebody who's already struggling. Like now they have to feel like, you see how unlucky I am? I guess, I should really take care of my life. I guess I shouldn't really live here. Look, even when I try to heal myself, I end up it just further goes back to those suicidal thoughts to like, I guess I shouldn't be here. You see, somebody deserved it more than me. So,
and exactly. And I think, I learned so much from it as a therapist. And one of the things that I actually learned was that for me, if I'm working with somebody, I do want longer term therapy before I dose them.
Absolutely.
Because I do think for some people, even the ones who were disappointed, it felt safer. And, so it's been a learning, but I agree. I think it's unethical. I think it speaks to this problem of randomized controlled trials designed originally for medication being used with people, not a pill, and they're designed for pill only kind of treatments that don't involve psychotherapy, that are not relational. And so I wrote an essay about this a million years ago in my doctorate. It's like one of my passions is like, actually, how do we change that system? And I don't think we're there yet. And I think it'll still be a long time.
Yeah, listening is right. I highly doubt it. Whoever is sort of approving these protocols, if they actually ever even spoke to 5 people who received placebo to know what it feels like, I doubted that person would be able to sign off on that protocol. Just listening to 5 people. Like if they actually watch some of these talks that I put together and these panels, like they'll just realize very quickly that this is cruel and we should stop doing that. Or at least you need to be a lot more careful the way that you're presenting it, your consent form, the way you're recruiting for your study. There's so many other pieces, and the way you're like the public image of it, like all these things you have to really take into consideration. And then also what is called the crossover, right? So like if you're going to then give them the active, then you want to minimize that period as much as possible. Not like, like 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, it's like someone may not have that. And like you said, but there's also people who I did interview who did receive placebo, and they felt like it was okay. They felt like they got double the therapy because they were able to like wait a year and then they had more time. And they felt like by the time they did receive the active dose, they actually sort of appreciated more. So that goes back to, again, how big of a perspectives exist there in sort of the spectrum of these lived experiences. And we can't just take one and make all of decisions based on one type. And we really need to like bring them all together. And that's where hopefully your MDs and PhDs could help with solving the problem, right? This is what I tell people. I'm like, I'm giving you the data, use your fancy job title and your academics, like, you should be solving that problem, not me. Like my job is to just tell you this problem exists. Go solve it, please.
Yes.
No, I'm joking, but obviously you have to solve it together.
We have to solve it together. Yeah. But also I think hopefully when things are, moving out of trials, some of these things can become easier, right? Like we're not going to be using placebo in the general population. But at the moment in Australia, the way that the system is working is that it is still quite restrictive in the amount of sessions that you can have. However, there's much more flexibility. So clients are coming to see me doing, at the moment, I've got 2 people who are potentially interested in doing psychedelic therapy at some stage, but they wanted to work with me long-term first to feel safe. And that's the flexibility when you're not in a trial context, right?
Exactly. And I think if you ask me how the best way to make these treatment experiences work is actually the most expensive way, unfortunately, right?
Yeah,
because the best way would be that you would never take someone off the streets and give them psychedelic therapy, whether it's in a trial or a clinic, I would argue. Like the best model would be that the individual is at your clinic or center already. So they're receiving their standard of care. They're already there. Let's say you're a PTSD patient and you're receiving EMDR or whatever, the therapy you're receiving at a center. And now you're hitting some wall. Things are not working for you. You're not getting the results that you're wishing, right? Let's say what we call treatment resistance, right? I don't like that label, but let's just so that people understand, right? So when they're arriving to that point, well, then now might be a good time, kind of like how antibiotics work. Like you don't just give someone Cipro day one, you try with like a smaller, like safer antibiotic. You're like, let's see what happens. If that killed the infection, okay, good. If not, they keep bringing bigger guns, right? So treatments are a little bit like that. So I actually don't think that makes sense to like even give somebody psychedelic therapy right off the bat. I don't know. I would just say, I don't know. It really depends on the context and the individual. But I do know, I think based on what I've seen in myself and others, is that if the individual was already at your center, already have support there, there's some history, they've already worked through some things, they're somewhat stabilized to then go through this experience. If you see it as the closest thing to a surgery, well, you don't just put someone through surgery without knowing that they're somewhat stable to go through that, right? So, but that can be done at the center. Once they feel like they're stabilized to now go through this sort of experience, which by itself could be destabilizing, right? Which not any destabilization is bad, because if you're stabilized in your depression thoughts, perhaps destabilizing you out of that is a good thing. Let's check this thing, right? But once you let it settle, well, then what happens? Well, then now the individual goes through the experience and then they're back in the same system. They still remain at the same clinic and a center. I'm not calling this preparation and integration. This is preparation before preparation and integration after integration. In the what we normally call preparation and integration, if that makes sense, right? It just means that you're still going to be dealing with the same team. You're part of the same system. You just happen, and that's how regular medicine also works, right? I have a primary care doctor. I have let's say family doctor, and I go to my family doctor. Now I need a need for a specialist, and now the specialist shows up, does some things. Let's say I once had actually during my trial, I ended up with some gastro in the middle of the study, and then I in the toilet, I fainted. Like I just have no memory of it, and I just have, my daughter was small, like something she brought from daycare, and I broke my nose. So it's like,
ouch. Oh dear.
And I remember I went to the surgeon. The appointment was 3 minutes, right? So I went to the normal doctor. He's like, no, you need to see this surgeon. Like he knows what to do, whatever, right? And like this guy just walked to the room for 3 minutes, just did something to my nose and walked out. He didn't talk to me. He didn't care. Like he was just so specialized in this one thing, right? But I could have not just gone to him right out of the street. I would have panicked. I'm like, what? So I needed something before. I knew I was at this hospital. I already had one regular doctor. I knew that this guy's going to come do something on me. And then I'm still protected and supported, right? So kind of, I think this is the way to do psychotherapy would be the same way. So that the individual knows that even if now they're not stable after the therapy, they have that support. It's the same care, the same people, so they can continue, right? Maybe so like that. But unfortunately, that's the most expensive way to do it.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it makes so much sense to me, and I feel that would be a really great way to do it. And I hope it's kind of where we're going. There'll be different versions of that, I think. But in a way, I guess the clients who I was speaking about are kind of doing that. Like they're here, they're working with me, and then we'll transition into that space later, and then come back to me maybe, or not if they don't want to. Right? That's fine too. Not everyone needs lots of therapy afterwards, but some people do. So I want to ask as well, to take us back into this kind of track, what you've been advocating for lived experience for quite a few years now. What's been some of the challenges that you've kind of come up against? And you talked about tokenistic kind of use before, which I think is something really important. Like, what's not tokenistic? And we've covered some of that, but maybe that will kind of flow a bit more into the challenges question as well.
Yeah, I can actually say, so I think this also is connected to what you asked would be surprising. So to my surprise, after doing this conference, to the summit that I did, the people and the professionals more interested in what I was doing ended up being pharma. More than anything else, to my surprise. Here I am thinking
Very surprising.
other therapists and training organizations and clinics and all these other people are going to care more about this. And why would pharma care about this? Turns out, like, not one training company actually reached out and said, yeah, you know what? We're training psychedelic therapists. Makes sense that they have access to this, right? Like, we're literally training them how to hold space for people. No, they didn't. And then pharma shows up, like the most like classic pharma. When new pharma offer, they're like, you know what? You're doing something very interesting. We need more of this in the world. So this came to as a surprise to me that I was like, oh, okay, I guess my understanding of the world is really distorted, you know, so like, to my surprise. And so I think, so one of the best ways that this, the challenge was this, that I actually, it's not knowing where this could work and not know. So like, I actually, for many years, I feel like I was putting my attention in the wrong places, right? Like this summit experience actually proved to me, like, who are the people and professionals that actually care about this versus those that just talk about it, or those that, you know, so like, to my surprise, there were individuals and organizations who I considered my supporters and people that I felt like they deeply care about this, right? And I got less support from those, and I got more support from, let's say, certain individuals and organizations that I was trying to stay away from because I thought they had money agenda or they didn't care about this work, and they ended up caring more.
That's interesting, isn't it?
I know.
Wow. I'm also surprised by that, but also it's like, it's a good surprise. Like,
I know.
I'm really glad. Like, I'm really glad that they were interested in.
Because, you know, so I think that was, you know, so one of the best ways is now, so I'm helping some of these companies now develop, let's sort of advisory board of people with lived experience. So as they're developing, especially those in the early phases of developing new, let's say, drugs for any sort of health indication, is like, well, then let's start doing this right off the bat. So the challenge is, I think, the lack of some of the main challenges. So if I'm on the other side, let's say I'm a psychologist, I'm a psychiatrist, whatever, I have a license, there is a licensing board, there's ethics, there's governance, there's like, you know how to deal with those people because they have to do things in some standard ways. Flip side, on the other side of the table, with people like myself, is a wild west, right? Because there's no one organizations that represent us. We don't have a licensing way. We everyone can't say anything. So it's like, in a way, it actually makes it harder for people to even want to incorporate this because they don't really know. Like, they're like, should I pay you for this? How much should I pay you for this? Is this even actual expertise? Like, so we don't really have. So in the future, what I've been hopeful to develop one day is that we have like something like a college of physicians, or let's say college of psychologists for people who live the experience. So hopefully one day we could standardize a level of training and certification for these people, right? So that they could be like, let's say someone could be like, oh, I want to go more work in policy. Well, okay, here's maybe some training specific to that. And then here's how you should speak about your story, right? If somebody wants to work in research, then for them to learn, like, okay, what should you say? What should you not say? The expectation bias, Like I said, like, it's not enough for someone to just have that experience. They have to go learn some other ways to, like, again, like knowing like what remains my experience and what can actually be translated into something useful. So I think some of the challenges that we're currently missing this link between these two, right? Like taking the experiential and finding a way to, so which is sort of what I'm working on. I'm like, I think as a result of this summit was I identify the area where this could actually happen. So I'm sort of actually trying to solve that problem right now.
That's great. So inspiring. And so, you know, and also, you know, I think the other thing that I think is really important is, just from my forays in this world, a little bit in the mental health space, is making sure that any kind of lived experience practitioners who are working or employed, say, in a space, also have support, right? because I think that what you shared, like, what's your story and what's useful, and also what do you feel okay to share about your story? Because I've also seen in places that shall remain nameless, people kind of being taken into a place where they're asked to share way too much, than that they feel safe to share, and in a way that doesn't feel appropriate, that then they're not given that support or training on how to work that out. Yeah,
exactly. And I've been on those panels myself. I've been with those people where they went on stage, they shared something, and I myself too, right? Because it's again, it's like it's so much easier to go on stage or a podcast or somewhere else and talk about your work. But it's not so easy to go on a stage on a podcast or somewhere else and talk about the dark night of the soul and your suicidal thoughts and like all sorts of challenges that someone might be feeling, right? So like at times, even I feel like the organizers, right, whether this is a research organization or a conference or a nonprofit, they don't really understand. To them, it's like, oh, well, I'm just bringing another speaker. I'm like, no, you're not just bringing another speaker. Like, it's not the same, right? So like maybe if you're going to have such a panel, if you're going to have, that individual, do you really have some support for them afterwards, right? Like, could they call somebody? Are the peers that are available? So like, these are some of the challenges again. So like the problems are not actually known enough to the more professionals for them to really know how to grasp it at even.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started this podcast, I was talking to everyone about it, and quite a few people said to me, oh, it would be great, because the premise of the podcast Beyond the Trip is to kind of really elevate the importance of psychotherapy. Actually, that was the original thing, as a part of not just the dosing, as a part of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, because there are a lot of whispers or shouts in the field about reducing it to just the dosing and a bit of supportive presence. And the way that I work and that we work in the clinical psychedelic lab is much more psychotherapy focused. I think it's really important. And so a bunch of people said to me, maybe you should get some people on to talk about their experiences, some trial participants or clients. And I haven't done that. And I haven't asked you today about your experience, only because you're so welcome to share anything that you want to, but I don't know. It's always such a tension for me, because I enjoy hearing that. And it's really, really helpful, but it feels ethically tricky for me because of some of the things that I've seen when it's gone wrong, and the pieces I've picked up with clients who've perhaps done something like that, or it feels ethically complicated.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah. Let's put it that way. And I agree. I'm with you. Even in the work that I'm doing myself, I feel like, again, it's just, we haven't understood the ethical considerations around that. How do we do it? At times, unfortunately, it becomes like a testimonial, right? Like, especially in the retreat space, even if it's a legal retreat, somebody goes there and then 6 months later, 3 months later, they're giving a testimonial about their experience in the sort of the honeymoon phase, when they haven't really reintegrated in their life again. Like even that, like, when should you share your story? We don't know. Even if you were to do that, is 3 months enough? 6 months enough? Should you wait 12 months? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's so much unknown, even if for someone, and I've done that myself. Like, I look back, the first time I shared my story, I think it was like maybe around less than 6 months. And I feel like now I watched that talk. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe actually I did that. Like, I knew nothing about this experience. Like, I had just come out, right? I needed a bit more time to actually let it settle and actually really feel what just happened, right? So I think it's very ethically complicated. And again, because there's no guidelines and rules or anything around it, and at times people actually get exploited. And this is both on the positive side and the negative side. We've seen it in the field on both sides, right? When somebody had a positive experience and they got exploited because of that, now they become like a brand ambassador for a company or a retreat. On the flip side, you had someone where it went really bad for them, and then the journalists and the media loves that, and then now they go and exploit their suffering, which, if you ask me, that's probably the most disgusting thing someone could do, to take somebody else's mental health challenges and suffering and exploit that to build their newsletter or social media following or whatever they're doing.
Or their podcast.
Or podcast or whatever the thing is, right? So like, that's probably the most evil thing someone could do under the name of patient advocacy or whatever. And we've seen that. But I think, unfortunately, again, because we haven't had a place where these people could be represented, where these people know where to go and what to do, then it's a bit of a Wild West. And of course, with that, people get taken advantage of, people risk themselves. And unfortunately, we've seen all of that. And we haven't really figured out how to solve those problems yet.
No, because it's also useful for people to hear from people who have sat in a medicine session and had a dosing, a little bit about what it's like. And, I shared a little bit about my experience because I thought, okay, that's mine. I'm happy to do that. That feels safe and okay to me. But there's plenty of podcasts that interview clients, people interviewing their clients. And I really enjoy listening to those, but I just don't feel that I can do anything like that. That's not my aim at all.
Yeah. No, I get it. It's fair.
Yeah. And is there anything, so we're coming up to the end soon, but there's probably more questions that I didn't get to. I sent us a big long list there. So is there anything that we haven't talked about that you really want to share that you think would be helpful?
I just want to leave a message is that for those that working in the field, the professionals, I just think, my advice is unsolicited advice is do more listening. Like just listen more to those that you're trying to serve, as long as they're not just working in the vacuum somewhere in the lab and, close doors, and it's just like open the doors, offer a seat, go out there, speak to people, right? Like they need to listen more than reading. There's a lot of reading the papers, there's a lot of reading the headlines, but not enough of actually listening. And that's for them. And I think for those of, people with lived experience, whether patients and trial participants, I would just be like, be careful, first of all, that you want to talk about is this something really you want to do? I think that, you can't really go back once something is online, it's online and all that. Like really make sure this is something you want to do with your life. And then figuring out maybe what area do you want to do this? Right? Is it more in the policy? Is it more in research? Is it more in practice? Is it more in education? Like figuring out where it's sort of like your story makes sense, right? And, maybe you're a first responder. Well, then maybe it makes sense for you to do more lived experience advocacy for first responders, right? So like trying to connect somehow to your own personal story and then finding your own unique voice to do things like that and getting involved locally wherever you are to see what are some opportunities to do that. And of course, Psychedelic Lived Experiences, which is the initiative that I run, is a platform for them too. If they feel comfortable to share their stories and be a part of what we're doing, then of course they're more than welcome to get in touch.
Yeah. And yes, I'll put the link to that in the show notes. There's some really great resources. And what's next for that with you?
So I'm organizing this year's conference and probably going to make some sort of changes to the formatting. So I'm literally just working on that as we're recording this, and I'll be announcing that all in April, hopefully.
Great, that's really exciting. I'm so glad to hear that. Can't wait. And I'm still enjoying the ones from the first conference. So thanks so much for your time. It's been so wonderful to have you on the podcast. And I feel like I could keep going with this conversation. I know it's such an area of interest for me. So hopefully we can talk again.
Yeah, definitely. We can always do a part 2.
Yes, exactly. I've done a few of those actually. It's been really nice.
For sure. Yeah. No, thank you for having me here and for inviting me. And it's been a pleasure to connect with you.
No problem.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in following along on the journey with me, check out my Instagram or website details listed in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share this podcast to help get this important conversation out to more listeners.